Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala khayril mursaleen. Muhammadin an-Nabi al-Ummi wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Amma ba'd. يقول الله تعالى في القرآن الكريم إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما اللهم صل على سيدنا مولانا محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم. And he provides for him from sources he never could imagine. And if anyone puts his trust in Allah, sufficient is Allah for him. For Allah surely accomplishes his purpose. Verily, for all things has Allah appointed in due proportion. This is one of the kind of favorite ayats because it says, and he provided for him sources that he never could imagine. Sometimes the Quran and other translations, it uses the words that Allah provides you by avenues, by system, by ways that you could never imagine, you know. In other words, things will arrive at your situation, in your condition, to aid and assist you, and you never even thought of them. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows you, He knows your situation, so Allah provides for you by ways, method, and means that you never thought of. So that's why this Yusuf Ali translation, and He provides for him from sources he never could imagine. Other translations say that Allah helped you from avenues, from ways, from possibilities that you never even thought of. And if anyone puts his trust in Allah, sufficient is Allah for him. For Allah will surely accomplish his purpose. Verily or truly Allah, for all things Allah has appointed in due proportion and just balance. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about our history so that we won't think that we just floated here and we stumbled where we are now. Because there are things that are happening in the world, even just today and yesterday, that may alter or have some effect. It won't alter our mission, but sometimes you have allies, aiders, helpers, and assistants in positions. And sometimes you have people that wear the same clothes, speak the same language, and they're in positions to work against you because they have their own agenda. I don't know if you can remember last summer, during some of those Black Lives Matter. In fact, it was just last summer. This is June, so it was during that period. So, some of our friends wanted us to appear on live broadcasts back in Iran. I don't know if you're, and they said all that, they had to have it. Because they had an interpretation of things that was going on here in America that was different than ours. They hoped what they saw was happening was real. And we was trying to tell them, no, this You can see, like right now, that was a year ago, where's it at? And it wasn't a year, it didn't take no year, it took a few weeks, a month. Pretty soon it was like, oh, that never happened. Now remember, we went out and visited with the people, and our lectures, our talks were more or less on what could be done to make use out of the situation. That you could have teach-ins, training, education, on demonstrations, on what demonstrations do, on an agenda. Can you imagine all of those people out there, all of those hundreds and thousands of people all over America, and nothing happened? Nothing. So that means that you're dealing with an environment. When you understand those things, you have to have absorbed a lot of environmental training. Your environment has taught you a lot. That's some of the things that we're going to talk about today, and some of it we'll talk about will be on situational positioning. The Tao is from the Tao of Beijing. This is thousands of years old. A lot of the training things that we went through, if you remember 2009, we didn't print it out, but we printed out a face covering and a few. It was called psychological guerrilla warfare. A lot of those things in there came from things that I studied 50 years ago at that time. It was from Chairman Mao Zedong, and he was the icon of the liberation movements during that period, in the late 50s, especially during the 60s and the 70s, all up into the 80s and what have you. When I went to Algeria, a friend of mine gave me a 4-volume set of, in about 71, of Mao Zedong's writings. And I always kept volume 1, because the other volumes had interesting things in them, but it was guerrilla warfare was some of the main writings, because in China they used mainly guerrilla warfare tactics. They used them against Chiang Kai-shek, who was the president of China at that time. They used them against the Japanese that invaded Manchuria in 1931 and changed the name to Manchukuo. Then in 1937, what they call the rape of Nanking. This was one of the capitals of China at that time, and it was the Japanese treated it real. It was unbelievable. In fact, in those days, after that, we used to refer to the Japanese as the white man of Asia. In other words, well, anyway, he's not like that now. But the militaries took over, and they stretched out. There's a long story about the history. But the human being have certain needs and what have you. And there's a hierarchy, a pyramid of needs. And I'd like to read the lowest and most fundamental level are the basic physical needs for food, water, sleep, and what have you. If you look in management books, there's this pyramid of needs, Maslow's hierarchy. I liked it it came out in 65, but I started reading it in early 70s, something like that. And I kind of liked it. The next level, triangle, contains our needs for safety and security. We need proper protection and shelter. So the number 3, love and belonging, is the next level and needs. To be loved and to belong to a part of a group. That's why in the old days, the biggest punishment you could get was exile from the group. They used to kick people out of the tribe. That was the biggest punishment that they could get. 4th level of need is self-esteem. We strive towards situations that enhance our sense of worth, our sense of value, the desire to feel important. Self-actualization, the need to fulfill our top potential and to live at a high level of awareness of ourselves and our desire, is the top level. When we've reached the highest part of the triangle, the hierarchy, we have what's called a peak experience, or the feeling that signals our arrival at the highest level of motivation. Okay, what I'm going to go over is a lot of what we talked about years ago, in 2005, 10s, 11s, and all that. Televised revolution, 2008. Historical epic, 2008. What's historical epic about? Historical epic is that we know the time, place, and circumstances we're living in at that time, and we have a good idea of who we are, what we're doing, and where we're trying to go. This is just a few years back, 2008. So we have all the tapes and all the seminars and everything all laid out. We were doing that then for a specific reason. In fact, 2008 was when a lot of fitness started in Oakland. 2008, this is the same time Abdul Malik left the community, and when he left, that was a signal for most of the other people. By the end of the year, it was only a few hangers along that were there, left there by the government, because the ones that left was the government. Everything there in Oakland was the government. Like, we'll just say 95% of what was happening here was the government. We've been knowing it all along. That's the way it is. That's part of situational positioning. In order for you to position yourself, you got to know where you are, and you have to have a pretty good idea where everyone else is. Right? That's what we call in somehow situational management, situational leadership. Right? So situational management, this is thousands of years old, but we have developed a whole new process of what we're dealing with, because these leadership and management principles of war and strategies of war are from thousands of years ago. And Chairman Mao, although he existed in the last century, he studied these too because he was Chinese. And when you study these, you'll see what he had been studying. But he had reference in all of his writings to ancient emperor so-and-so and, general so-and-so back thousands of years ago. But he had certain principles that he followed. One was strategic retreat. Strategic retreat is that you're fighting, let's say, the Japanese. And the Chinese had very good strategies. They was really getting whooped a lot. They was killing them by the millions. But they had some cases where the Yangtze River flowed through and it cut a new channel and it flowed this way, right, to the ocean. So what they did was, with all of those Chinese, when the Japanese bought troops, I shouldn't stray, but I can't help it, so in China, there was something called the Tanaka Plan. It was a Japanese foreign minister in 1924. He had a plan for China, the conquest of China, because Japan is a small island nation, right? But he said Japan is a small country that's well organized and well disciplined. But we don't have enough people, we don't have enough land, right, to move toward world conquest. So the Tanaka Plan in 1924 was to, when they invaded China in 1931, that was the plan. To build their world empire through their vision, through their discipline, off the backs of China. Right? They would conquer China. And the Japanese, of course, later on, they invaded all of China. But the problem is, China is as big as the United States. is close to it in size, including Alaska. So before they made Alaska a state, China was technically bigger than the United States. But anyway, this Yangtze River flowed through China. They let the Japanese wanted to conquer China, but the Chinese said, what we'll do is we'll give up space for time. Space for time. So, when the Japanese would come into a certain area, the Chinese would change the course of the Yangtze River back to its old way of flooding. You know what I mean? All the time they just fill it up and the water would go, and guess what it would do? Why? It would flood all the Japanese. They got all their tanks. They got all their troops pulling all them heavy guns. You should see them on videos. They have what they did. They flooded all their embankments. They flooded everything. Right? And then they would go on about their business. Now the water would flood that area and it would flow around it, and then it would go back into its channel, maybe 100 miles downstream, maybe 200. What do they care? So the Chinese would flood. The Japanese had a strategy: build our world empire off the backs of Chinese. And so Chairman Mao said this. He said, Japan is a small country that's strong. China is a big country that's weak. Simple. You can see it in the Dow. So In that case, they had to use their weakness as strength. It's simple. So they used their weakness as strength. Their size, the number of people, right? They lost hundreds of millions of people. But that's one thing they had in abundance, is people, right? Okay. So now we have to get to the Tao of Masjid al-Islam, our strategic management patterns. We're not going to get lucky. The United States will not just flow away. So we have to be thinking, we have to be studying, and some of the lectures that we'll show you, historical epic, 2008. Historical epic is telling you some of the same thing I'm telling you now. That there have been epics in history. There has been military epics in history, social epics in history, religious-backed or led epics in history. They really happened. So we had to study all of those, no matter what idea you get from the media or how many people is here, don't pay attention to that. You see, we are who we are. It doesn't make no difference what they say we are. Right? We are who we are. We have already done the stuff we're talking about today. We've already done that. We're evolving into another stage of activity right now. And everything seems to just be happening at the time we have chosen. But see, when you study Islam, it tells you, just like the ayat I read, that Allah will help you from avenues, from ways, from means that you never even thought of before. Allah will help you from ways you never thought of before. You never had no idea that you was going to get help, aid, and assistance coming from that direction. Okay. So now, one of the things that we had to develop, which technically during that stage, we've already developed some manual for Islamic movement. You know, manual.